Thank you all for joining our webinar today on addressing water-related impacts in the packaged meat and apparel industries. Today's webinar will dive into the findings and implications of new first-of-its-kind research led by Ceres and our colleagues at Bluerisk in partnership with DWS and S&P Global Sustainable One. And this research really fills gaps in the existing research to estimate the cost of addressing a company's impact on water and the financial implications for investors. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Ceres, we're a nonprofit organization mobilizing corporate and investor leadership on sustainability issues, including water resources, which is the focus of today's discussion. And for over a decade, we've been working with investors and companies to further efforts on addressing water risk. So today's research is an outgrowth of a lot of that initial thought leadership and thinking. But before we dive into the discussion with our terrific group of panelists today, I wanted to just help set the stage, take a step back, and also provide a bit more context and how this research really fits into the larger picture and our efforts around the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. So as many of you know, just like the climate crisis, the water crisis is already happening all around us. Water scarcity is growing more dire every year. Surface and groundwaters are becoming more and more polluted, are facing many emerging threats. In fact, scientists are estimating that the global water demand will exceed supply by up to 56% within the next 10 years. All you really have to do is pick up a newspaper to see water risks playing out in real time. In fact, where I live here in Southern California, we're in the midst of a serious drought. Our governor has declared a drought emergency. The Metropolitan Water Agency, which serves 19 million people, recently also declared a drought emergency. So we see this playing out in your own backyard. So time is really running out. There isn't a company on earth that can operate without water. And the global water crisis really is systemic, far-reaching financial risks for nearly all economies. In fact, in a Ceres analysis, we found that at least 50% of the stocks listed in each of the 4 major stock indices are in industries with medium to high water risk. So investors really are in the crosshairs of the global water crisis, and companies and investors can really no longer ignore this critical issue. So what can investors do when it comes to water risk? Well, investors can better understand water risk, first of all, and then also act on the water risk within their portfolios and within the companies that they own. As an example, in 2017, Ceres launched the Investor Water Toolkit in partnership with our Investor Water Hub. And this open source toolkit really is a how-to guide for investors to use and really understanding water risk within their portfolio. But then importantly, the work must go beyond just understanding water risk, and investors and companies must act to help mitigate this risk. So to this end, Ceres and our partners at the government of the Netherlands launched the Valuing Water Finance Initiative about a year and a half ago now to really amplify the work we are doing and further support investors to engage with companies on water sustainability in ways that really create that meaningful change on the ground. The Ceres Valuing Water Finance Initiative is designed to provide investors with the tools required to really make that case, to prioritize water risk and to successfully engage with corporates on water. So here, as you see in the slide, are the various elements of the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. First, we are partnering with key asset owners and managers on this work. We're building out a robust scientific case of why industry and how industry is impacting water resources. And then today's webinar is focused on the piece of the pie that's highlighted there in red, building out and better understanding the financial risks of failure to act on water. So here you see our leadership body of 14 pension funds and banks. We call them the Valuing Water Finance Task Force. And they are guiding us in this effort and ensuring that the research is useful and helps move the ball forward. In the next slide, we've also, you see, we've assembled a robust group of asset managers, again, to help inform this work and make sure it resonates with the investment community. Just in terms of next steps with the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, we'll be releasing the comprehensive scientific assessment of how industry and certain industrial practices are impacting water resources. So that will be released soon in the new year. And then we're also building from that work and developing a set of corporate expectations, and we'll be releasing that early next year. And those will really serve as the framework for investors to use as we drive towards a collaborative investor initiative, investors engaging with companies to drive large-scale change in corporate water practices. So I invite those on the call to join us in this critical effort that will launch early next year, and you can find more about that on our website. So with that framing, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves and bring them into this conversation so we can dive into some of the findings of the research. Also, I'll note that after a panel discussion, we'll be holding some time for questions, so please type any in the chat as the conversation proceeds. So first, I'll turn over to my colleague, Paul Reed, to introduce himself and share about Bluerisk.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Thanks, everyone, for joining. My name is Paul Reed. I'm the founder of a small company called Bluerisk. We provide advisory services, research and analysis, really focused at helping the private sector understand how best to respond and address to emerging water challenges across their value chains. Bluerisk has existed for 2 years, and prior to that, I spent 9 years at the World Resources Institute, where I led their work on water and corporate water stewardship. So yeah, thanks, Kristen.
Thanks, Paul, and I'll turn it over to Virginie.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to be shorter than what the text on the slide suggests, which seems very long. So I'm Virginie Gallas, head of Croquis Company Analysis. Croquis is for cash return on capital invested. It is an equity valuation model proprietary to Deutsche Bank. It is based on free cash flow, and its main aim is at really making all accounting data comparable from one company to another to allow true comparison in terms of profitability and valuation. I've got another role, which is co-head of DWS Micro Research. And for those two roles, I'm involved, of course, in how to best integrate, let's say, ESG issues into the valuation of company, the equation of valuation. Looking forward to this debate today and this presentation.
Thanks, Virginie. And then Steve Bullock.
Great, thank you, Kirsten, and hi everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to present today, and just a little bit of background on my role. So, I'm currently working at Sustainable One, part of S&P Global, which is a kind of a centralized sort of source of sustainability intelligence within the group. I was formerly of Trucost, who were acquired by S&P back in 2016, having been there for about 10 years. My team is the sort of innovation and solutions team, and we are responsible for innovating new data sets related to climate and water and so on, and also working with companies and investors to help them report on a whole range of sustainability issues. And I spent a number of years working in the kind of area of water risk, worked with Paul as well before for many years. So again, very excited to have the opportunity to present today, and back to you, Kirsten.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion, and of course for your partnership on the research itself. So I want to start off with just giving the audience a better understanding of the scope and the findings of the analysis. Of course, it's all available. You can dive in more deeply. The research is on our website. But Paul, you're the study's lead author, so I want to first turn to you, and if you can walk us through a bit more of the scopes and the finding of the analysis.
Sure, yeah, happy to. And maybe just to kick it off, both of the briefs are available for download on the Ceres website. And just to flag that this work is really the result of a collaboration amongst the Ceres team and DWS and S&P Global Sustainable One and my colleagues at Bluerisk. My colleague Jenna Stewart's on the line as well. So it's really the result of a collaboration amongst all of us. But I'm happy to go over kind of the scope and approach that we landed on. I guess the first clarification is kind of why we decided to focus on exploring financial implications of addressing externalities. And I think it's fair to say that we'd noticed in recent disclosures that more and more companies were sharing or disclosing cases in which externalities that were not addressed were leading to financial impacts, right? They were leading to risks that were materializing as impacts back to the company. And a lot of the methods that we've seen out there to evaluate water-related risk are focused really heavily on understanding physical climate risks to the company. So trying to understand how physical risks related to climate and water are affecting or could affect the company's performance, but much less so are they covering the question of how a company's impacts or company's performance is affecting water resources, right? So how are a company's activities potentially impacting water resources and therefore, really becoming externalities for the company. So that's the reason why we decided to explore this question, is to really understand to what degree are water-related externalities material, and to what degree will addressing those externalities impact the company's valuation. And that's really the scope of what both these briefs do, is to explore that question. We have a common approach that we took for both sectors, and it's actually you could replicate the approach to any sector. We chose these two sectors because they both ranked high in terms of externalities based on publicly available research produced by University of Saskatchewan, which they are also a key partner in this work. And we started by looking at the findings of their research and identifying water-related externalities across the private sector, and specifically focusing in on these two industries, and then matched or tied those externalities to very specific activities, right? So what are the activities within each of the industries driving the externalities? And then we looked at where those activities took place across the corporate value chain. For both the sectors, both the industries, using generic value chains for both of them, for the apparel industry and for the packaged meats industry. After that, we estimated the degree to which these externalities were having an impact in the world, and the magnitude of that impact globally, and then attributed a fraction of the externality or of the total impact back to the companies, right? So how much of this issue, whether it be pollution or scarcity, how much of that can be attributed to each one of the companies that we looked at in each of the sectors. And then once we had that externality attributed to the company, we estimated the cost of action required to address it. It was an annualized cost that included both CapEx and OpEx, based on existing research and cost estimates. And then once we understood what that cost of action was for each externality, for each activity across the company's value chain, we could aggregate that to come up with a total annualized cost, estimated cost, and then use that to estimate the impact that additional expenditure would have on the company's valuation using the Croce framework that Virginie alluded to. So that was the approach that we took for both industries. Again, we how we implemented it varied based on the data we had available, but the approach was the same. In terms of like the scope of activities, if we go to the next slide, that we focused on for the packaged meats industry, we looked at 3 companies, and we looked at a generic value chain for the industry, and then from the University of Saskatchewan research that looked at publicly available information on externalities. We're able to identify a bunch of externalities. You see on the x-axis there at the top the activity, and then the externality, and then the impact and implications in terms of risk. So we were able to kind of map those, as I said before. And the ones that are in green are the ones we included. I don't know if you can see it, but there's some are highlighted in green. So nutrient loading, so non-point source pollution, water withdrawals associated to grain production for feed, nutrient loading and water withdrawals associated to animal raising, mostly driven from managing manure and then livestock water requirements, and then point source pollution and water withdrawals associated to packaging and processing. So those are ones we included. There are definitely other externalities that are material. Unfortunately, the data just isn't there for us to be able to include them, and or we lacked approaches or methods to attribute those externalities to the company. So for one or the other of those two reasons, the cells in white include those externalities that we just didn't cover as part of the research. And then if we look at the apparel industry, similarly, you see on that y-axis the value chain sections, and then the activities, externalities, impacts, and risks on the x-axis. And here, the cells in green again include what was considered as part of the research based on the data that was available. I think it's worth flagging that non-point source pollution and herbicide pesticide use and fiber production stage of agriculture was not included, but water withdrawals and then point source pollution associated to wastewater discharge across most of the value chain was included, and we looked in this case at 8 different companies. So in terms of what we found, some of the key findings, you can see the results there in terms of the implications. So the total cost for the packaged meat industry was small. I don't have the exact numbers right now, smaller compared to apparel, but in terms of the impact on EBITDA, which is what I included here, it ranged from about 4.7 to over 7% for packaged meats, but a lot higher for the apparel industry. You can see there in that chart on the right hand side, ranging from close to around 20 to over 40% of an impact on EBITDA. Those are industry specific results, and the briefs have a breakdown of these results per company, a lot more detail. But in terms of kind of overall for both sectors, what we found is that because there were externalities that were excluded from the research, it's likely that the actual cost and the impact on the company's valuation might be higher than what we found here. It's very hard for us to tell, without having done the research, but I think our assumption is that given the number of impacts and externalities that were excluded, that total cost and impact is probably higher than what we found. But what we've seen also from disclosures, mostly from the most recent reports from CDP, is that the cost of inaction could be a lot higher of the cost of action, right? So the cost and implications of addressing the externalities is high, but not doing anything, taking a pathway of inaction could imply a lot higher costs back to the company. So we're under the impression that addressing these externalities really offers an opportunity for these companies to create value by future-proofing the company, by giving investors confidence, right, that the company is addressing the issues and impacts across their value chain moving forward, and really preparing and addressing to the challenges that are emerging over time related to water. In terms of moving forward, what this means for investors is, there is enough information out there to do this type of research, particularly, if the work is conducted by the companies in question, right? The data is available to come up with estimates, at least estimates of the magnitude of the externalities, and what that means for the company. So investors should really encourage companies to consider doing this type of research to help inform and understand whether the actions that are being taken by the companies are aligned with the areas of highest impact and highest risk across the value chain. This is something we've heard a lot, and most of you've probably heard as well. It's very important to keep that contextual nature of water challenges in mind, and make sure that the actions and commitments that companies are making in response is aligned where the issues are, where the impacts and risks are. And then lastly, because of those two things, we hope that companies that aren't currently doing this really kind of build on some of the methods and and recommendations proposed herein to assess their impacts on water resources and look at all the opportunities it offers to take proactive action in addressing them. So that's kind of what we're seeing is kind of key opportunities moving forward. So anyway, this is very high level. As I said before, there's a lot more detail baked into the briefs themselves, but I'll hand it back to you, Kristen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, Paul, and for sharing some of those important takeaways for both companies and investors. So now I want to pull in the rest of the panel. So a key piece of the analysis and research was the sensitivity analysis, and Virginie DWS led this piece of the work. So I was hoping you could share, getting a little bit into the weeds here, but important weeds. Can you share the financial and accounting considerations that you see as particularly important when thinking about the cost of action to address the externalities? And how did you think about that as you did this analysis?
Yeah, sure. I think a very critical aspect, as often for the global investors, let's say, is to make sure that data ultimately are comparable. And this needs to be the case from the very beginning, upfront analysis to the very end. That is when assessing, the water externalities themselves and their cost all along the value chain. You need to make sure that you use comparable data. For example, any ratio that would refer to revenues, like when some companies would not disclose the consumption of cotton, for example, and you need to assume to make a number of assumptions using revenues and using ratios of other companies publishing. Then you need to make sure revenues you use are comparable. And for apparel companies, for example, some companies would have high share of retail revenues, while some others would be mostly on wholesale revenues. So you need to provide a level playing field, let's say. And in the same way, when looking at valuation ratio and the impact on those valuations, the impact on the profitability, you need to make sure here again that those bases are comparable. So we know accounting data are not always comparable, and that is again very much the work of Crookie to make sure we make them comparable by making a number of economic adjustments. And ultimately, what we want to show for the investor is what would be the ultimate cost for the company, the impact on the valuation, and to start with, is there any risk of sustainability for the company? Yeah, because of if it was to pay for the full cost of water externalities, right? And is there any ability for the company to mitigate this risk? And how can it share this risk, pass on to the consumer party? So those are critical aspects, I would say.
Great, thank you. Yeah, those are important questions for investors to think about. And also, as Paul alluded to in his remarks, it's also important to think about, is not doing anything, putting the stock value at risk in the long term. So that's something we'll talk a little bit more about. But, Virginie, just to follow up and dive in a little bit deeper, what was your reaction when you saw the results for the two industries? Any key takeaways that you can share for packaged meats and apparel?
Well, as Paul was saying, the impact on cash flow is in fact quite different in packaged meat and apparel, and that was the first observation. In packaged meat, the impact on the post-tax cash flow of companies range from 4% to 7%, more or less, for the three companies we have in our sample. In apparels, this impact on post-tax cash flow is from 15% to 37%, so much, much more. And I think Paul will come back on the reason why. Second observation, within the industry itself, the impact of water externalities costs can be very different from one company to another. And this, despite the fact that the calculation done by Paul and Jenna at Bluerisk has covered the entire value chain, right? Not only the stage covered by the companies and depending on their vertical integration, but instead really the entire value chain, right? So you would expect the cost potentially to be quite comparable from one company to another within the industry, because in all instances, it would cover the whole value chain. When in fact, it's not the case. And some of the reason why is, again, Paul will come back on this location of the production, how the water stress can be in those locations, etc. But there's also economic reason. That is, the business model is not necessarily the same for all companies. And as a consequence, level of profitability may not be the same, level of indebtedness might not be the same. The accounting aspect, again, may not be the same. And all of this ended up in the result not necessarily being the same on valuation and profitability metrics for companies within industries.
Great, thank you for those insights. So Paul, turning to you, we just sort of heard from Virginie some of the differences in the results for the two industries. So can you sort of share your insights on why these discrepancies from your point of view, and sort of how do you see both of these separate analyses of the two industries really both providing key insights and interesting insights?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to. So Jen and I took a look at the research again in advance of the webinar and kind of went through it again just to kind of ground ourselves in what are potential drivers for this difference that Virginie alluded to. And I think one thing that jumped out right away is that the total volume of water withdrawals across both sectors is comparable within orders of magnitude, right? It's not like one sector uses a ton more water per company than the other. Based on the size of the company, it's very comparable. The main difference in why the cost to address externalities is a lot higher in the apparel sector than in the packaged meat sector for the companies that we looked at is really twofold. One is for the packaged meat companies that we looked at, the proportion of total withdrawals and discharge in the agricultural sector is a lot bigger than for the apparel sector, right? So for the packaged meats industry, for the companies we looked at, the volume of withdrawals and discharge that is taking place in the agricultural sector is over 90%, right? So the bulk of that interaction with water is in the agricultural sector, whereas in the apparel sector, despite a high dependency on agriculture to produce natural fibers, relative to the full value chain, water withdrawals and discharge, that's only 30 to 40%, right? So what this means is that the implications of addressing externalities in industry versus in agriculture is very different, and the solution cost is very different, right? Specifically addressing non-point source pollution and reducing water withdrawals in agriculture is a lot cheaper per unit than it is in industry. So right there, that alone is indicative that with comparable levels of withdrawals and discharge in both industries, one has a lot more happening in agriculture, and in agriculture solution costs are lower, right? So overall, the estimated total solution cost and implications for the valuation is probably going to be a lot lower than for apparel, where a lot of those activities are happening in an industrial context, where the solution costs are a lot higher, both in terms of CapEx and OpEx requirements. So that's kind of one, I think, potential driver that Jen and I came up with. The second one, and this is important, I think Virginie touched on it, is that specifically for the companies we looked at, and obviously this isn't going to be representative of the whole sector, but for the companies we looked at, the packaged meat companies are on average located in areas with a lot lower, higher, or I would say not higher levels of lower levels of water stress. Right, the three companies we looked at, their value chains are on average, a lot less exposed to water stress than the companies we looked at in the apparel industry, and specifically where they buy cotton from. We didn't have detailed information on cotton countries of origin, but on average, just looking at average volumes of cotton purchased in the market, the top 10 producing countries, a lot of that cotton is coming from areas suffering from water stress. So what that means is that the requirements to address externalities, related to water quantity are a lot lower for the packaged meat industries that we looked at, because they're just not in areas of water stress, or not as much compared to apparel, where a lot of their footprint is in stressed areas, therefore requiring a lot more reduction in overall volumes. So those are the two kind of bigger drivers that we saw that have implications on the cost, and therefore have implications on the impact on the valuation. In terms of interesting insights or things to call out based on that, there are kind of two things. One is it's really, really important to understand the type of activities, as we said, and where those activities take place, to understand the implications of externalities, right? Because you'll need to know what type of solutions are required and what's the cost. And for that, you need to know, okay, what activities are driving the externalities? Is it agricultural practices? Is it industrial? And where are they? Are they in places that have abundant water, in which case there is no externality for water quantity? Are there in places where there is no water available for others, and the externality might be quite large? So those two dimensions are really critical, and that's going to be company specific. We really feel like the only way to answer that is to really look at each company. And then the second kind of key takeaway for us, and I don't know that we've talked about this before, but the bulk of the externalities for both industries are outside the direct control of the company. They're in the supply chain. So to me, in terms of key insights moving forward, is that supplier engagement and supplier incentives and cross-industry, almost pre-competitive collaboration is almost a must to address these, right? It's not sufficient to have, high ambition within your four walls and be doing a lot with your employees within your four walls in your factories. That's great. But if you really want to be serious about addressing externalities and addressing risks in both of these industries, you're going to have to start thinking about how are you engaging your suppliers, what incentives are in place, how are you helping suppliers address these, and how are you collaborating? Because in both cases, you're sharing sourcing areas with everyone else in your industry, right? So how are you working almost in a pre-competitive way to collaborate with others in your industry and other industries to address the issues? And actually, that's going to be, I think, one of the highest or top ranked cost saving opportunities is that collaboration, because that'll allow for you to really bring down the cost of action significantly by engaging and working with others. So in terms of opportunities, to me, that would be top of the list of something that I'd look to be pursuing.
Yeah, no, those are great points. It's really it's important to unpack those drivers and differences between the different industries and the companies, and sort of think about really going beyond the four walls to address those externalities. And I will mention that another piece of research that Ceres recently released called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, which is a benchmarking of 38 food companies based on their water management, sort of gets into and unpacking that last point, Paul. And it really confirms the meat sector is a sector that's assessed and really confirms that, that sector is not rising to the challenge in addressing and mitigating its externalities. So a lot needs to be done, and just further builds the case for that. So encourage folks to check out that piece of research too. So Steve, turning to you on the data side. So S&P Global Sustainable One played a key role as a data provider in this analysis. So was hoping you could share your insights, given your knowledge of the ESG data space. How do you see this type of research and analysis being used by companies and investors? And sort of also, how do you see this research really fitting into the existing landscape out there?
Sure, no, great question. Thank you. I guess if we just sort of take a step back a moment and look what's happening in the sort of ESG market more broadly, we're seeing more and more investors looking to integrate ESG considerations into the investment process. And to give you an example of that, we've now got over 100 trillion in assets under management tracking the UN principles of responsible investment. And this is starting to turn into action. We've seen huge inflows, for example, over the last couple of years, huge inflows into ESG funds, for example. We're seeing banks and supervisors considering climate change and water risk more broadly as issues that could affect the stability of the economy. So there's a huge kind of shift in investor expectations. We're seeing increased regulation and political pressure, for example, and I guess more and more reporting requirements trying to address the gap in transparency on some of these issues. And I think most importantly also this kind of recognition that ESG is a driver of corporate business value. or in other words, that climate risk and water risk is really financial risk. And there's more and more evidence now about how companies that are performing well from an ESG perspective are also performing well from a financial perspective. And I guess what this is doing, those three kind of things combined is creating demand for more data, more intelligence on these financial implications. How your dependency and your impact on water, for example, how that can potentially impact the financial performance of your business. And in the same breath, though, it's creating that demand, but there is also a bit of a gap. And I think Paul touched on this in his introductory remarks about water and how kind of historically there's been a lot of focus on looking at the physical climate impacts of water stress, water availability around the world. What's been missing is that kind of translation into financial impacts and implications. So I'm really excited about this research because I think it slots in very nicely. It sort of addresses that gap, if you like. I think it provides that toolkit for investors and companies to understand and measure that risk, but also gives them the tools to take action. And I think that's a really important part of it. The other things I think that are really important when it comes to data is having that kind of standardized approach. I think Paul mentioned that this is something that can be taken across different sectors, but at the same time, it's value chain specific and it's location specific. And if you're looking at water risk, we know that it's very much a location specific issue. So without understanding where in the world these companies are operating and also what they're doing, without understanding that, it's very hard to really provide a robust assessment of that risk. So I think this research is very timely. I think it comes at a time when I said there's huge demand for this type of information, but also huge gaps. It comes at a time when we're recognizing the kind of significance and risk of water availability and water stress going out into the future. We actually released some research a few weeks back just highlighting that water stress is going to be the biggest risk facing the European continent over the next several decades. So very, very timely. And I said, it really provides that toolkit for companies and investors to start taking action. And I think that's a huge, huge plus point.
Great points. So you mentioned sort of the huge gaps that are still out there. So, given that and what you just shared, how should investors be speaking to companies about data? What should they be asking for?
Yeah, no, again, great question. And I think from an investor point of view, as I said, there's this kind of ambition to integrate ESG factors into the investment process so that investors are understanding and measuring risk across their portfolio. But of course, also understanding what are the right questions to be asking companies in those portfolios around water-related risks. So I think, again, this data really shows and highlights, this research really highlights the types of things that investors need to know. At Trucost or S&P Global more broadly, we work with companies, we work with investors on both sides of this, and we quite often hear this kind of challenge that investors aren't getting the information that they need and companies aren't quite sure what information to disclose. So I think this research provides, again, that kind of framework, that toolkit that investors can use to start asking the right questions. And I guess some examples of that would be, how these companies are, first of all, how they're measuring these risks, and specifically how they're measuring their dependence, the value of water to their business and the impact through externalities that they're having on water systems. I think it's important for investors to know that the governance, and the risk management frameworks that these companies are using to manage these risks, but also kind of what action they're taking. And I sort of talked a lot about action. I mean, it's obviously hugely important to understand where you are from a risk perspective, but actually what you do next is really critical. So, again, investors will be wanting to know from these companies sort of what targets they have in place, for example, to reduce and eliminate these impacts, whether those targets are context-based and specific to the locations in which they're operating, how they're engaging as well with other stakeholders. We know from these two sectors that it's very much a supply chain issue. So how are these companies kind of engaging with their suppliers on these issues, but also how they're engaging with other stakeholders in the water basins in which they operate? Because we also know that it's really a collaborative. There's a need for collaborative action around water risk management and I guess water stewardship more broadly. And then finally, I guess, how they're reporting, because really all of this is about increasing transparency as well. So how are these organizations reporting on these types of issues? And as I said, this research really kind of highlights some of those kind of key points that investors will need to understand from the companies in which they're invested.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, a lot of good discussion points there. So Paul, over to you, building on Steve's comments about sort of the data and how investors might use it. Can you explain a little bit more about how the cost of action was estimated and sort of what are the main opportunities for improving these estimates? Our hope is obviously that companies and investors will pursue this type of analysis and these estimates will improve over time. So can you speak to that?
Sure. So we had the list of externalities from the University of Saskatchewan. So we could start with we started with that. One of the first things we did is we wanted to acknowledge, or we did acknowledge, any public commitments from the companies we looked at to address either the total externality or a fraction of it. So we went through each of the companies, and if they'd made commitments to, treat all of their industrial effluent to safe standards, we acknowledged that. If there were commitments around reduced withdrawals and operations, acknowledge that. If their commitments around sustainable sourcing, we looked at what that meant for water, which sometimes it means a lot and other times it doesn't. We went through and really looked at the implications of existing commitments to acknowledge, current actions that companies are taking. Then, as I said before, we looked at the extent of the externality, and for water quantity, that involved geospatial analysis. You need to know where the companies are operating and where they're sourcing from, what's the level of stress. Ideally surface water and groundwater, both, and then attributed a fraction of that externality back to the company. We did that using factors basically that allowed us to basically estimate based on how much they're, what ingredients and what volumes they're purchasing and how much of that ingredient is contributing to the externality. So we were able to kind of do that to attribute the externality. And then we took published estimates on cost of solutions, and these are averaged across solution types, right? There's hundreds of types of solutions and interventions. We didn't look at every single one, but we said, okay, on average, taking a cost curve approach, this is the effectiveness and cost of, the solution types available, and we applied that cost to the attributed externality to each of the companies to, across each of the activities across the value chain. And that gave us a cost per section of the value chain that we could then aggregate up and hand over to DWS for this sensitivity analysis. So that's what we did. Tons of decisions went in, as you can imagine, for each externality, each activity, what data source, where. So a lot of decisions are all documented in the appendix of the briefs in a lot of detail. And the limitations are documented as well. In terms of opportunities, I think there are a few things. Top of the list to me is just work with the company, right? A lot of the companies are doing more than they say. And, because of our position at Bluerisk and our engagement with companies, we know as a fact that there's a lot happening behind the scenes that if you engage the company and ask about, I'm sure they'll be happy to share. A lot of really great work that doesn't always get out there right away. So one is just sometimes give some of these companies the benefit of the doubt and engage them and ask them directly about these questions. They also may be a great source of information if you do want to do the analysis with the company. They're for sure going to have a lot more detail into the information we need. And so that's one, just kind of work with the companies on this. And then secondly, it's, I think using more detailed solution costs is probably another area for improvement, breaking down CapEx and OpEx. And we spoke to Virginie quite a bit about that early on, and, whether we can make that distinction or not. And, for this analysis, we used a kind of a lumped up cost estimate, but if we were to do this in more detail, I think that much more granular breakdown of the cost would be helpful. And then the last one is that, there are a lot of upsides to taking action and quantifying those benefits and turning this into like a cost benefit analysis, I think would be a huge area for improvement, because it could really help strengthen the business case for action, is that there are a lot of upsides to doing this, and those upsides can be quantified. And we're working with a number of clients on cost benefit analysis of an intervention based scenario to address water risk. and capturing those benefits and quantifying them and comparing them to the costs, I think would be something that can be really exciting and really impactful as well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so this is a great start and really important start, but obviously definitely can refine and make all the more useful moving forward with better data. Great. And I will remind the audience that we are going to try to save some time for questions. So a few have already come in, but feel free to put those questions in the chat and we'll try our best to get to those. So Virginie, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about sort of how companies might be motivated to act, at this point. And so, really from looking at company financials, how do you think companies should use this type of research? What are the options for covering the additional expenditures related, to these externalities and really required to eliminate these externalities? How might a company think about this?
Well, I'm not sure I will cover all the different options, but what is for sure to start with is corporates need to be aware of the cost, even before talking of the cost of water externalities generated all along the value chain. Right? It's a must. And as Paul was saying, as expert as one might be, at the end of the day, companies in the industry are best positioned to know exactly the details of the value chain, the economics, and as a consequence, what sort of water cost, water externalities are generated. So knowing those water externalities and assessing the cost, and this research is precisely here to assess the cost, and we can clearly see how important, critical is the collaboration with experts on the matter. Because the company knows the supply chain and details and where there's water externalities, but when it comes to estimating the cost of resolving those water externalities, I mean, we need the support, they need the support definitely of experts. So as Paul was saying, collaboration is a key word in this sort of assessment, right? Knowing the cost for companies, the cost of water externalities and resolving them is also knowing the cost of inaction, and alternatively, and we know that cost of inaction can be much more, and there is this estimate that it can be 5 times more in this area. And finally, I would say the necessity of the company to know this cost of inaction is also to communicate in a better way with suppliers, with clients, with investors, and asset owners, ultimately. And on this, the sooner the better, because it will come to them at some stage, either the cost of resolving those water externalities or the cost of not resolving. So again, the sooner the better, and to share the cost, to your last question, with the various stakeholders, they need precisely to communicate and enter in a real discussion about this. And then, of course, to what extent they can pass on to suppliers, to clients, is also a function of the economics and the competitive advantage and negotiation power, as we know.
Yeah, great points. And sort of building on those thoughts, I think as companies are exploring new commitments, and we see examples of, sort of leadership and best practices and moving towards, net positive water, this side of the equation, really the impacts the companies are creating on water resources really can't be overlooked. And I think that's an important takeaway for me from this research for sure. So Steve, turning to you, wondering if you have a perspective to share if companies that, you may be working with or that you are seeing, that are really already moving in this direction. Any examples that you can think of that you want to share?
Yeah, no, sure. So over the past several years, we've collaborated with Ecolab, the water technology company based in the US, on the development of the Smart Water Navigator, which is a platform that companies can use to kind of understand and quantify financial risks associated with their use of water and dependency on water, and then also formulate plans to sort of address those risks and put together smart water management plans in place to do that, which includes, of course, setting context-based and sort of region-specific targets. So there's a few examples that of companies that we've seen start to use those types of metrics and those types of tools to integrate that into their kind of decision-making process. And one of those is Microsoft, who actually looked at the water risk across a series of their data centers, quantified that risk in monetary terms, and then put in place a series of sort of water efficiency measures and investment in water stewardship initiatives at those specific sites, and achieved quite a considerable reduction in water use, but also a significant cost saving as well. And I think that again really speaks to the other side of this equation, is that you can use these types of insights to provide that justification and that business case, strengthen that business case for investment in those types of initiatives where it makes most sense to do so. And yeah, just to pick up on one point that Paul made around this kind of this cost benefit analysis, so important for organizations to have the right intelligence and insights to be able to make more informed decisions about where to allocate capital. So it's encouraging that we're starting to see more organizations do this. And yeah, I hope that this research again will help kind of drive some more of that around the world, especially for those companies that have a higher dependency on water through their supply chains as well, which I think is a really important focus area.
Yeah, definitely. I sure hope so. So Virginie, over to you. Curious how you at DWS as an asset manager really plan to internalize these findings, and how might you communicate or share this out with your peers and suggest that they think about some of this research?
So of course, this research and the result of this research will be broadly shared with all our colleagues within DWS, of course, all members of the ESG team, but also analysts, PMs on the platform, to make sure that anytime it is relevant, they integrate the result of this research into their analysis and into the assessment of the risk on one hand. On the other hand, we're talking double materiality as usual, and they need also to consider the impact the company is having to the outside on the planet and on water externalities precisely, right? So it's really these two aspects. Using this in engagement, as highlighted by Paul and Stephen, is very important, because when engaging, having real discussion with companies, you need evidence to support these discussion. And with the ultimate objective, of course, of having an impact in the real world and potentially helping redirect, a real capex decision, real economic capex decision to the right in the right direction. Ultimately, asset managers and asset owners need to know also and integrate the cost of those water externalities, because they will be the one bearing this cost. Ultimately, so and if not the cost of resolving, again the cost of inaction. So it is very important that we asset managers integrate, of course, this and sort of analysis into our investment decision. And this collaboration and analysis is really exactly what ideally we would do for any ESG issues the company would face, right? That is, taking based on the economics, the specificities of the industry and the company, and considering all stages of the value chain, estimating the cost of those externalities at each stage and very precisely. Unfortunately, it's never easy to do, but we still lack a lot of data to do this in an extensive and full way for all kind of issues, I would say. But that is a major step in this effort, I would say.
Yeah, great points. And then just one final question to close before I turn to a few audience questions. So Virginie, back to you. At the onset of this conversation, I sort of framed this work as a core piece of the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. And I know DWS is one of our founding members of the Valuing Water Finance Investor Working Group. And so just curious if you can share your thoughts really briefly on, why is this collaborative effort among the investment community so important, and why did, DWS prioritize this work, and maybe why should others join us?
Mm-hmm. Well, first on the subject of water, as was said several times, it is a key subject, and as evidence in Mercer report in 2020, so it was deemed as the area where there's the least progress being made, and it's urgent, of course, for things to change. So that is one first good reason, I would say. And since 2019, DWS has made a number of initiatives and efforts in this area. So first, we started to integrate the water risk and externalities aspect in the investment decision as much as possible, starting 2019. In 2020, we published a report which was called a transformational framework for water risk, where we propose a number of solutions on how investors can also deliver transformational water investment across all asset class. And this research paper was later, remarked in the UK Pension for Purpose Best Environment Impact. So leadership. Our head of research, Francesco Pierto, is also a member of the World Economic Forum Transformational Investment Initiative, which looks at how systematic risk could be converted into sustainable returns. And finally, in the COP26, a member of our research team was invited to the Water Champion to join CDP Water Advisory Council and to become part of CDP Technical Expert Group on water disclosures for financial institutions. So I would say the collaboration with Ceres, which, as you said, is a long one and has several aspects, was really key for our effort on water. And again, it was a fantastic illustration of how productive the collaboration between experts on those specific thematics and financials and asset managers and owners can be. So again, very important for this viewpoint, and also because of course Ceres is a major initiative gathering asset owners and public authorities as well, and as a potential major impact. So it was a pleasure and again very productive collaboration. And thank you for having this opportunity to work on the water subject.
Well, thank you very much for those kind remarks. Definitely appreciated your partnership as well. So a couple quick questions. I know we're running short on time, but one came in for Paul and another quick for Steve. So maybe if you each can answer in about 60 seconds. But Paul, first to you, a question came in about sort of coming at it from the company vantage point. What are the different pathways for companies to really ensure investors that they are addressing this? What actions might they take, or what might they, disclose? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way for investors to gain confidence that the company is taking action is to have public commitments that reflect a level of understanding of where these externalities are across their value chain, and an ambition that's proportional to the magnitude of the impacts or their contribution to the impacts. In a nutshell, I think that's what investors and other stakeholders are looking to see.
Great, thanks, Paul. And then Steve, a question came in for you. Do you envision, down the line, perhaps there would be some type of KPI that would be, more speak to the extent of water externalities and these impacts that are created? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, great question. I do expect there to be sort of more standardization, I guess, around how companies and investors do report on externalities more generally. And water would be obviously one of the key ones. I think, that's the kind of, I guess that's kind of the way that a lot of these reporting frameworks are moving in now, is looking at the impact of externalities on the business, but also your impact on those as well. So yes, in short, yes, I hope and expect that there will be more standardization around these kind of KPIs going forward.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour, but this has been really a terrific discussion. As mentioned, we hope you all can access this research. It's available on our website for download and dive in more deeply. But, really, as we've talked about today, the current approaches for estimating water risk typically ignore this important piece of the equation, really leaving companies and investors exposed. And so while the cost of addressing these impacts can be quite hefty and definitely varies across the sectors, it is really likely that it's actually quite cheap in a way compared to the cost of inaction. So we hope folks really download this research and utilize it, and hopefully we can build off of it and really help more fully understand the entirety of water risk using this as a good guide and tool. So thank you all to the panelists for joining us, and thank you to the audience. Really a great discussion, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.